Exploring the Mind: 7 Ways Children's Storytelling Skills Impact Literacy Development.
Well, welcome. Thanks again for coming out. So just a little bit about the talk series, if you haven't attended before. So about once a month, we bring somebody over from the psychology faculty to give a talk at the library on topics that we think would be of interest to our community. This is our effort to sort of make connections with the Ann Arbor community. We've had talks on addiction, on depression, on choking under pressure, on aging, on a whole bunch of different topics. And if you'd like to get on our email list and get announcements about future talks, there's a piece of paper back there on the table with a pen. If you just write your email address on there, we'll add it to our list and you'll get all the future announcements. Well, it is a great pleasure for me to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Nicole Gardner-Neblett. She's an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Michigan. She got her undergraduate degree at Brown University and actually did her PhD in the psychology department at the University of Michigan. She was awarded a graduate research fellowship from the National Science Foundation and a dissertation award. Most recently, she worked as a research assistant professor at UNC Chapel Hill until we managed to recruit her back to Michigan as a faculty member this past fall. Her research focuses on factors that promote children's language and literacy development with the goal of improving the early learning experience of young children. And tonight she's going to be telling us about ways that storytelling can impact the development of literacy. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gardner-Neblett.
Thank you, Thad. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really excited to see this turnout because I know that there are 2 other talks going on at other branches. So I appreciate you all coming out tonight. So I will be talking with you about children's storytelling skills and the implications that those skills can have for their literacy development. Now, I brought a few of my favorite childhood books. Hold on a minute. I brought a few of my favorite childhood books with me today. Stuart Little, Little Women, and Charlotte's Web. So these books often make the children's list of best books of all time, and there's a reason for that. They tell great stories. Every child should be able to understand great stories such as these. Now, what if I told you that a child's ability to understand stories like these is a function of how well they tell stories themselves? So that's what I'll be talking with you about tonight. So over the course of the next hour, I'm going to be talking with you about 3 things. 1, the low literacy levels in the United States. 2, the 7 ways that storytelling connects to literacy development. And I'll be wrapping up with talking about ways that you can support the children in your life to develop these storytelling skills. So I hope by the end of the evening, I'll be able to convince you that storytelling is a really important skill and that if we want children to be better readers and writers, we need to give them opportunities to practice telling stories. All right, so low literacy in the United States is a crisis that rarely makes national news, yet it's something that many Americans face every day. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, 1 out of 5 Americans are functionally illiterate. That means that they have difficulty completing tasks that require basic literacy skills in English. So this could be comparing and contrasting information, it could be paraphrasing, or just even making low-level inferences. And most of the people that suffer from that experience functional illiteracy are native English speakers in the US. That 20% of Americans translates into 43 million people. So just to give you a sense of what 43 million people, how many people we're talking about here, we'd have to take the big house with its capacity of over 107,000 people, and we'd have to multiply it by more than 400 times to accommodate that many people. And so that's 43 million people that are going through life without the strong reading and writing skills that are needed to to do well in society. And so this has personal implications for them, but it also has implications for our society and our nation as a whole. So I'd like to introduce you to one of those 43 million people. This is Cindy. And Cindy is about in her mid-50s, and it wasn't until her mid-50s that she learned how to read and write. She has had learning disabilities since she was a child, and it made her, that's where her difficulties with reading and writing came from. She remembers a time when she was about 12 years old, and she asked her siblings how to spell A. And they thought she was kidding. And so they kind of teased her like, oh, you're just joking. And when they realized she was serious, they teased her about it incessantly for quite a while. She ended up having to drop out of school in the 10th grade, but she eventually went back and got her GED, her general education degree. And the way that she was able to do that without having basic literacy skills is through memorization. She went on and became a certified nursing assistant through, again, lots of memorization. And even though that job requires that you complete paperwork, she would trade off with her coworkers and say, well, you do the paperwork and I'll take care of the patient. And so these kind of ways of compensating for low literacy levels is pretty common. So she would just go through life, get help from her husband. When her kids were little and it was time to tell them a story, she would pick up the book and pretend like she was reading. So after some time, her husband encouraged her to go get some tutoring. And so she eventually did. And she went for about 3 hours a week for about a year and a half before she was able to develop really strong enough reading and writing skills. She talks about how she eventually was able to develop strong enough skills so that she was able to go on her own without her husband to apply to purchase a new car. She was able to fill out the application all by herself. So when asked about this newfound ability to read and write, she says, it's like opening up a Christmas present every day. It's just awesome. So as we can tell from Cindy's story, these issues with literacy don't start in adulthood. They start very young when children are young. And we know from national data that about 35% of US fourth graders are proficient readers. So that's 1 out of 3 that are able to integrate and interpret text and apply their understanding to text, to draw conclusion and make inferences. But that also means that 2 out of 3 children cannot. So unless we do something to improve the literacy outcomes for our children, we know that they're going to grow up into adulthood and face challenges. And so this is something that we need to be addressing from early on. I suggest that, of course, there are many ways that we can support children to have stronger literacy skills, and I think that storytelling, oral storytelling, is one of the ways. So when we see a person that's reading and writing, but in this case, let's focus on reading, it looks like they're doing a pretty easy task. They're sitting there with the book, just looking at it and drawing some inferences from it. But when they are reading, they're actually doing something that's pretty complicated. They're drawing upon many different skills. Now, one set of skills that they're drawing on is called the code-related skills. So these are the kinds of skills that help us to understand, to make sense of these markings on the paper and what they are. So this includes print conventions. So in English, we know that we hold the book in a certain way and we read from left to right and from top to bottom. So that's something that you have to be able to understand. You also have to be able to understand, there we go, alphabet knowledge. So you have to be able to understand what the alphabets are, the letters of the alphabet are, and you also have to understand what the correspondence between those letters and different sounds are. You also have to have phonological awareness, so this ability to attend to the sounds of language, the different sounds, and to be able to manipulate them. The second set of skills that you need to be able to have are these general oral language skills. So you have to be able to understand different words and what they mean. You have to be able to understand the syntax, so how we put together sentences, how we order the words so that they make sense, and the grammatical rules that we use. You have to have conceptual knowledge. So you have to be able to understand things about the world to help you understand what you're reading. So take for example, the word bar. You have to understand that bar could be something that a ballerina uses to practice her routine, but bar could also be the place that college students go to on the weekends to have fun, right? There are these two meanings, and your conceptual knowledge helps you to know that. Right. The last oral language skill is narrative discourse. And so this is the ability to tell an original story and also the ability to retell a story. So of course, all these skills are really important in learning how to read. And if a child has difficulty in any one of these areas, they're going to have a harder time. But I want to focus on tonight the narrative skills and the importance of that. Okay, so there are many different types of narratives. So let's say that this girl here, her name is Aisha, let's call her Aisha, and she could be telling her friends at the slumber party three different types of narratives. So she could be telling them a autobiographical or a personal narrative. So this is about an actual experience that happened to her. So if she tells them about the time she visited her cousins in Florida and they saw an alligator walking through the backyard and it really did happen, that's an example of a personal narrative. She could also be telling them a scripted narrative. So this is about a routine event that happens repeatedly. So if she tells them that at her soccer games, her parents come and they yell so loudly, "Go Aisha," that she gets so embarrassed, and this happens repeatedly, this would be an example of a scripted narrative. And the last type of narrative that she could be telling them is a fictional narrative. So if she tells them, "Oh, that house on Maple Street is haunted and it's so spooky and it's really just made up, it's not really haunted," then that's an example of fictional narratives. So I'm going to be focusing tonight on fictional narratives. These are the types of narratives that are most closely been linked to literacy outcomes. So children start telling these narratives at a very young age. So from as young as 2 or 3, a child will tell you a very simple narrative with 1 or 2 events. By the age of 4, they tell what's called leapfrog narratives, so narratives that may jump around in the sequencing and may not be in chronological order. But by age 5, they're able to tell these narratives that are more sequential, but they end at the high point, so you're left wondering, so what happened? But by age 6, they're able to tell stories in linear order and that have some resolution, and we consider these narratives to be classic narratives. So of course, as children get older, they continue to provide more detail, more information in their stories, and this is a skill that continues to develop over time. Now, just to give you an example of what a classic narrative looks like, I'd like to share this example with you. We'll call this girl Amelia, and she's about 4 years old, and she's going to be telling you about a walk that she took in the jungle one day. Right.
Well, once upon a time, I was walking in the jungle, and I stopped. And when I stopped, I just heard 2 snapping branches. But then I knew I was surrounded with hungry bears and coyotes, and one of the biggest coyotes and bear grabbed me, and I did the double eye poke, and that made them startled. And they let go of me, and then I went as fast as I could until I got to my truck and drove home, and I did. And then when I drove home to my mommy and daddy.
And so you were safe?
Yes.
Oh, I'm so glad
Yes.
to hear
Yeah.
that.
And the bear and coyote never found me again.
So she's obviously telling a fictional narrative, and she's quite precocious in her storytelling ability. She tells us a classic narrative that's sequenced, it's organized. She tells us how she resolved this problem of these hungry bears and coyotes. And you can see that she's using vocabulary that we don't typically use in everyday conversations. So snapping branches and that they were startled. Exactly. So This is an example of quite precocious storytelling. But think about how these different skills that she's drawing upon in doing all this sequencing and giving us a resolution of this problem and how she solved it could perhaps help her when she comes to her literacy development. So this obviously could have a big impact in terms of how she's able to write stories, just her own level of creativity, but it can also give her a framework for understanding written text herself.
Well, what?
All right, I know you want to hear that again, but I've watched it many times. It's great. Every time I still smile. Yes, ma'am. So I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing she's about 4. Yes. Yeah, she's exceptional. So this is not a typical 4-year-old story. I will admit that. Okay, so now you've had an example of a great storyteller. And so now I'm going to be talking about the different ways that that kind of storytelling skill can help Amelia and other children when it comes to their literacy development. So there are these 7 ways that storytelling can be connected to literacy. So I'm going to go through them quickly, and then I'm going to talk more about each one of them. So one of the first ways, just starting at the top and going clockwise, is helping them with the transition to written text. Another way is just supporting general thinking skills, having phonological awareness that we talked about a little bit earlier, and also an awareness of your audience. There's also importance to be artful in terms of being creative in your storytelling, and that's also important for literacy. And we'll talk about, so funny, every time that I do this on different computers, the N gets dropped down here, and I don't know why. Anyway, that's supposed to say reading comprehension. So we'll talk about the ways that this storytelling can be linked to writing skills and also reading comprehension. All right, so let's get started with the first of these storytelling connections, and that is the transition to written text. So when we think about language, language is on a continuum from contextualized to decontextualized, and there are these 2 types of language that are on these extremes ends. Okay, so the first, on the contextual side, this is the type of language that we use in everyday conversation. So it tends to be focused on what's happening right there in that particular moment, and it's focused on things that are concrete. Oftentimes there's a shared knowledge between the listener and the speaker, and it's really, like I said, it's bound by the context of what's going on. So at the other end, we have this decontextualized language, and that's language that is what we call the extended discourse. So it's not just 1 or 2 sentences, but it's longer chunks of language. It tends to focus on things that happen either in the past or things that will happen in the future. And because of that, it's not in the immediate context. It tends to have language that's more abstract. Oftentimes, there's not a lot of shared knowledge between the speaker and the listener, in contrast to the contextualized, and it's removed, as I said, from the immediate context. So what are some examples of this kind of language? So to give you an example of the contextualized, so that one, this one, yeah, let's go over there and play with it. Okay, throw it to me. Oh no, I'm so sorry. Pinch your nose. Hang on, I'll go get help. So we don't have a lot of information here in terms of what's going on. It's like when you tell a joke and people think it's not funny, you kind of say, oh, you have to be there. So it's kind of like that. You need to be in the immediate context to understand what is happening. So on the other end of the decontextualized, it gives us more information to understand what's happening. At recess, David gave John the red football, and they ran over to the field to play. David told John to throw the ball, so he threw the ball really hard and hit him in the face. David got a bloody nose, and he was screaming. John said, pinch your nose. Then John ran and got the teacher. So we have a lot more detail here to provide us with information about what actually happened between David and John, between these 2 people. And you can see that the grammatical construction of the sentences are much more complex, and there's a lot more information about the context in terms of the place where these things happen and also the time. And so this decontextualized language is definitely much more complex than the type of language that we use in everyday conversation. And it's also the same type of language that we see when we encounter written text. And so the idea is to think about how when we tell these kinds of stories, we're actually practicing using decontextualized language, and that can help facilitate the transition to written text. So the question is, when do children start using this type of decontextualized language? Some researchers at the University of Virginia asked this question. They recruited 67 preschoolers for a study, and they asked them to tell a story using a wordless picture book. And they analyzed the children's stories based on this literate language, what they call literate language features. And these are features of the stories that demonstrate that the children are using decontextualized talk. So these are noun phrases like the big red house, adverbs or conjunctions that are connecting different portions of the story, and also mental or linguistic verbs like think and believe and say. And these are the kinds of features that they analyzed the children's stories with to identify whether they were using decontextualized language. So the book that they use, the wordless picture book that they use to elicit children's stories, is the Frog, Where Are You book. And this is a book that was published in 1969, and it's by Mercer Mayer, and it is, without a doubt, the most commonly used the wordless picture book in children's narrative research. And the reason that I think people have kind of got into this, it's almost like a routine of using this book, and so it gets just used again and again, because then you can extrapolate back to other studies and see if there's similarities or differences. But I think the main reason that it's been used so often is that it has a main character that has a problem, and it shows very clearly with the illustrations how the main character solves these problems. So it gives children great material to write, to create a story. And then because it's wordless, there are no words, so children can't rely on those as clues as to what the story is about. So in case this wasn't your favorite book as a child, I will go through it. So the book opens with this picture of this boy with his dog and his frog. And one day while the boy is sleeping, the frog gets out of the jar. And when the boy wakes up in the morning, the frog is gone. And so the rest of the book goes through the boy's adventures through the woods trying to find his frog and all the things that he gets into. So as I mentioned, the researchers were analyzing the children's stories that they generated from this book to see if it had, how often they use these literal language features. So they found that they divided the children by age groups to analyze their stories, and the dark blue are the 3-year-olds, the medium blue are the 4-year-olds, and the lighter blue are the 5-year-olds. And so what they found is that by far the noun phrases are the most commonly used form of literate language features. I'm so sorry, I just touched my mouse and it's very sensitive. Okay, I'll go back. All right. Sorry about that. It's hard to find your mouse. See? Okay, so they found that the children are most commonly, they're using these noun phrases, and conjunctions are the next common. So what they didn't find any differences by age in terms of the noun phrases or the adverbs, but they found that 4- and 5-year-olds are more likely to use these conjunctions and these mental linguistic verbs they're more likely to use them than 3-year-olds are. And so this research shows that from a very young age, as young as 3, children are using this decontextualized language in their stories, and this could have some preparation for them to use this language in their literacy as well. Okay, so the second of the 7 story connections is general thinking skills. So a researcher at Rutgers was interested in identifying the extent to which children's storytelling skills were linked to their general thinking skills. And the idea is that when we tell stories, we're drawing upon a certain framework in our minds of how we organize information and how we make sense of the world. And therefore, the thinking is that there might be a connection between how we tell a story and how we think about things as well. So they recruited these 72 preschoolers. And as you can see, they used this book, Frog, Where Are You? Like I said, it's the most commonly used book. I think just nearly all of the studies I will tell you about, except a couple, use this book. There's just no avoiding it. And they asked them to generate the story. They also gave them these general thinking tasks, so working with blocks or doing some nonverbal reasoning to get a sense of how they think generally. And they analyze the stories according to 3 different types, so illogical, action-based, and consciousness-based. This is what they call them. And so the illogical is just like basically descriptions and not really telling a story in so many words. Action-based deals mostly with what's happening, but not with how the main characters are feeling or what they're thinking. And then the consciousness-based uses descriptions of what's happening, but also includes how the character is thinking. And so to give you a sense of what these narratives look like, here's an illogical one. The child says, that's a dog, and that this is a kid, and this is a frog, this is a dog, and this is a kid, and the bumblebee come out. That's a dog, that's not a bumblebee. So you can see that there's not much of a story going on here, but it's more of a description of the illustrations. So the second type that they looked at was action-based narratives. And so remember, these are the ones that have more of the descriptions and actions, but doesn't give us as much information about the internal state. So the child says, it has a window, the dog has a glass on its head, the dog jumped out of the window, the boy jumped out of the window, he's lost, it's raining, a bee come, bited his nose, the boy is looking in the hole in the tree. The owl knocked him off the tree. He's on a rock. He's on a reindeer. He's still on the reindeer. He's falling into the water. The boy and the dog got on the log. There was frogs. He's holding the frog. So a lot of description about actions that are going on, but not a clear storyline. And so the last type of narrative that they analyzed was the consciousness-based. And you can see with each of these narratives that they're getting longer in the text. So this child says, the frog is in the can, the dog is going to eat. Then the frog got out, then the boy went to sleep, and then the boy wake up and he said, where's the frog? Then he looked in his food, then he opened the window, then the dog stuck his head in the can, then the dog broke the can, then he went outside, called for the frog. The boy thought it was in there. He thought it was in there, but it was a beaver. Then he wasn't that, but it wasn't in there. Then the boy called in there. Then the owl came out. Then the boy climbed down a rock, then called for his dog and frog. Then a deer came and carried the boy. And then there was the dog, and that was his dog. Then the deer dropped them. They fell in the water, and he was doing to get out. He got on the log, and there was the frog, and there was his frog. Then his pants fell down. So you can see that we have a clear description and some basics about the plot of how the frog is gone and the boy is looking for it, but we also see a little bit more about the boy's internal states and what he's thinking. And so the question is, does the type of narrative that a child tells, is it linked to their general thinking skills? So when they looked at the types of stories that were told in comparison to their general thinking skills, they found that the consciousness, does this work? No, it doesn't. The consciousness-based had higher, so children who told these consciousness-based stories scored higher in terms of their general thinking skills, where children who told these illogical or action-based stories scored lower. And so the idea is that as a child's ability to structure a story is somehow related to their cognitive skills, their general cognitive skills, which may also play a role in their literacy development. So the third of the 7 story connections is their phonological awareness. And so as I mentioned, phonological awareness is a key skill in terms of literacy. It's the ability to attend and manipulate these language sounds. So I have a few examples here to test your phonological awareness. So one of the ways that we test it is by having children seeing if children can combine words to make a new word. So if I say star plus fish, exactly, very good. You got it. Okay, so here's another one. Rice without the r. Bingo. Okay, so if I say sad, replace the s with a d. Exactly, dad. So you get a sense of these phonological awareness skills. So it's a foundational skill for being able to learn how to read. And some kids come to it naturally and they just pick it up really easily, and other kids need a little bit more help with it. So once kids are able to do this, develop this phonological awareness, it helps them with decoding the letters. It's easier for them to understand that certain letters have certain sounds. So the question is, does this storytelling skill predict phonological awareness? So some researchers in Canada set out to answer this question, and again, they used the Frog Book. They had 89 preschoolers aged 4 to 6, and they tested their skill so they gave them those kinds of tasks that I just showed you, with phonological awareness, and they also analyzed how well children were able to structure their stories. So what they found is that even after taking into consideration a number of different language and literacy skills, including their alphabet knowledge, their word reading, how much vocabulary they knew, their memory, and so forth, the storytelling skill was still linked to their phonological awareness. And they think that it's because the ability that they're tapping into this phonological awareness and storytelling skill is tapping into a similar kind of skill in being able to manipulate parts into a whole. And so with storytelling, you're manipulating these different events or different ideas and bringing it into a whole. And the idea with the phonological awareness is that you're manipulating small sounds and making them into larger sounds. And so the idea is that this reflects some kind of mental reasoning or understanding of how parts are related to whole, and that can have implications for literacy development. All right, the fourth of the 7 storytelling connections is audience awareness. So for this, I'd like you to think about the last time you told a story. So this could have been a made-up story. This could have been a story of something that actually happened to you. Think about how you told that story and how you decided to tell what to say. So whether it was conscious or unconscious, there were probably some questions that flicked through your mind before you started telling your story. So you may have thought, what will my audience think? What do they already know about what I'm about to say? Will they even care what I have to say? And how will they react to what I have to say? And so whether we're conscious of these questions or not, we're likely to adjust how we tell the story based on how we think the listeners, your audience, will react and how they will respond. And so there's no studies that I know of that have linked a child's audience awareness, their ability to perceive that, to their storytelling and literacy, but there is an interesting study that I wanted to share with you that has some implications for this. So in this study, researchers, again in Canada, they wanted to know whether children who got some training on perspective taking in different contexts would be better or worse at building their storytelling skills. So they were asking the question of whether or not face-to-face interactions in supporting the development of audience awareness or perspective taking would work better than having telephone-only contact. And so they gave them these short 10-minute training sessions for 12 of them over the course of 4 weeks. And they had children tell their stories using, again, the Frog Book before and after the 4 weeks. Okay, so again, these were the two conditions. So in the telephone-only condition, the child did not see the researcher. The researcher was in another room, and so they worked together on a number of different activities. Both of the conditions worked on the same kinds of activities that you would think would encourage perspective taking. So they were doing puzzles. They were also telling stories from wordless picture books. There was also an activity that involved giving directions on a route. And so all of these things are thought to support perspective taking. And then in the face-to-face condition, the child and the adult work side by side with each other. And so again, they did this for 12 sessions over 4 weeks. And so the results showed that the telephone sessions were actually more effective at supporting developing storytelling skills. So when they compared the before and the after of children's stories, they found that the children who were in the telephone-only condition had improved to a greater extent in their stories than the children who only had the face-to-face. So I have an example of the stories. So in this story, let's call this Cody's story, and in his story was 71 words. So once there was a boy and his dog, they caught a frog. Then one morning, the frog got away. They went to catch another one. They looked for it. The dog found a beehive. They looked inside the hole in the tree. The bees came after the dog. An owl came out of the hole. They looked behind a log and found a frog. Caught one. It was, and they saw more. So not bad. But Cody improves greatly after the 12 sessions. So don't try to read this because it's really tiny. But you'll see that from 71 words to 220 words. And there's a lot more detail that Cody gives in his story. So once upon a time, there was a little boy who caught a frog. He was looking at it at nighttime with his light on. He was smiling. When he went to sleep, he was yawning, and it was still nighttime. The light was turned off, and the frog started escaping. And then when he woke up in the morning, the sun was out, and he was awake. He had his mouth like an O shape, and his frog was gone. And so he looked out the window, and his dog's head got stuck in the jar, in the jar. And he was calling for his flog, that's supposed to be frog, and he went looking for it. And then close to a rock, there was a little rock. He climbed up on a rock with his dog, and then he was actually close to a deer. Then he fell on a deer's head, and then the deer ran off with the boy on his head. The dog was running after, and then when the deer stopped, they fell. The boy and his dog fell into the water. And then there was croaking sounds, and he was smiling, and his dog was on the boy's head. He said to be quiet to the dog, and he took a small little flog. Then he went home, and he was happy. So you can see that he tells a lot more. There's dialogue in there. There's more information about how the boy feels and more details about what's actually happening. And so the idea is that in these telephone sessions, the child has to reconceptualize how they present the information because they become more aware that there are things that the listener cannot see. And so they practice being able to tell more information and more details, whereas the idea is that if you're face-to-face, you take things for granted, right? Because you're in that more concrete situation there. All right, so like I said, I don't know of any studies that have linked this to literacy, but I would imagine that being able to have a better perspective of your audience would translate into thinking about how would I write this for an audience that I'm not able to talk to, but I need to have it written down so that they understand it. And also when you're reading, thinking the perspective of the author, who is this author writing to what extent does that pertain to me? So audience awareness may be a key piece. Okay, let's get to the fifth of the storytelling connection. So that's what's called artfulness. And so I'd like you to think about a person that you consider to be an excellent storyteller. So I'm guessing that this person has a certain style to the way that they tell stories, that they in some way make it fun to listen to them, and that you feel like when you're listening to this person, you're right there with them, with the stories that happens. So for me, that person is my dad. This is a picture of me with my dad taken many moons ago. And my dad grew up in Antigua, and he came to New York to attend college in his early 20s. And oftentimes his stories would juxtapose his life in New York from his life in the Caribbean. And as always, whenever he spoke and told stories, I could vividly see the images that he's sharing with me with his words, whether they're lessons of things that he learned from his father or how he would challenge his professors in college. They were always, and he always wove in some kind of humor, and he would give his characters different voices. And so this, to me, is this artfulness of making a story interesting. And while there are no known studies that I know of that have looked at artfulness in children's stories in relation to their literacy development, there's some work that I'd like to share with you about how artful children's stories are. So some researchers at Ohio State University did this. They recruited some preschoolers and got them to tell frog stories. Yeah, we just call them frog stories. So they got them to tell these frog stories and analyze to what extent they were artful. And they define artfulness as the extent to which the narrative goes beyond simply recounting the events in a story to captivate the attention of the listeners through embellishment. Artfulness encompasses the creative, imaginative, and joyful elements of stories. And so they came up with 15 different elements that they considered to be artful elements of children's stories. And the green that you see here on this chart are what we consider appendages, so the things that come at the beginning and the ends of the story to orient us. The blue are what we call orienting, so the things that give the listener some background information about the character and the setting that the story is taking place in. And as you can see, most of the artful elements are these yellow or orange, depending on your perception. These are what we consider evaluations, so the things that the storyteller will use in order to move the story along. So we can see that the most common type of artful element that children are using in their stories are these adjectives or adverbs. About half of them are using, or a little over half, it's giving us some information about the character and what kinds of personality this character has. And many of the children are giving us some indication that the story is over. Usually it's the end. And some children are giving us motivations and thoughts, but you can see that very few children are giving us some introduction or opening summary to kind of orient the listener to what the story is about, and they're not giving many interjections or repetitions to kind of make the story come alive in terms of, and he hollered, and he hollered, and he hollered for his frog. So that was one of the examples that they had. But again, most children are not using that. Surprisingly, for this young age, and remember these are preschoolers, quite a few are including some humor in their stories and dialogue. And some children are changing their tone, so they may be whispering while the boy is sneaking up, looking for the frog. And they're giving that, but it's fewer children that are giving those kinds of details. And so we can imagine that a child's ability to include these kinds of artful elements into their stories may also come into play when they come to write different stories, and them being able to put those kinds of elements into their stories. Okay, the sixth of the seven, storytelling connections is writing skills. So some researchers were interested in whether storytelling skill predicts writing ability. And they followed 32 children from age 5 till they were age 8. And they assessed their storytelling skills not by using the frog book. It's very rare. But they gave them what's considered a play narration task. So they gave them some play animals that look sort of like these, and they told them that these animals were having a verbal conflict, and that these things were happening, and how could this child finish the story about what happened. And so they analyzed the child's story in terms of how elaborate, what kinds of plots the child wove into their stories, to see how well they were able to craft a story based on that prompt. And so they did that at age 5, and then at age 8, they gave them a written narrative task. So they showed them a set of pictures similar to these of a toy bear family that was out and about, and asked them to write up a story about this toy bear family. They had the stories evaluated by external experts, literacy and language arts experts, and the experts ranked the stories in terms of a 1 to 4 scale. Most of the stories ranged in length. The shortest story was only 3 sentences, but the longest story was about 14 sentences. So they found that over the course of the 3 years that these early storytelling skills predicted later writing skills. And this is even after they considered the child's early language abilities. And so if the extent to which a child was able to tell a better story in terms of constructing a plot and elaborating on the details, that predicted the quality of the child's story as it was evaluated by these external reviewers. And so the idea is that this early competency in oral storytelling is really important for later writing competency. Okay, so last of the 7 storytelling connections is reading comprehension. And this is the area of research that has the focus, that has had most of the attention on in terms of the storytelling literacy connection. So you'll remember our person who's reading and all the different skills that she or he is pulling on. So there's those code-related skills and these oral language skills. And so when we think about the oral storytelling skills, theoretically, these skills are supposed to be able to support reading comprehension after children have already mastered these code-related skills. So the idea being that once the children have these code-related skills and they're able to decode and understand what these words mean, that their storytelling ability supports their reading comprehension, so their ability to understand what they read. I remember when my daughter was in kindergarten, we were having a meeting with her teacher about her reading abilities, and I was, as a language literacy researcher, concerned, can she read? Is it okay? And she said, oh, she's doing fine, she understands, and she gave an example of another child who could decode everything, who could read these chapter books basically in kindergarten, but had no comprehension of what she was reading. And so being able to decode is not enough. You need to be able to understand what you're decoding and make sense of it. And so the idea is that this early skill early skills telling stories can help support that. And the reason is because of the focus on decontextualized language that we talked about earlier, and also the ability to structure stories to organize the information, as those 2 things are thought to support later reading comprehension. Okay, so some researchers in New Zealand, it's just amazing that this work happens internationally, all over the world. So these researchers in New Zealand recruited 58 children, and they studied these children from when they were infants all the way up to age 16. And so when the kids were 4 and 5, they gave them a story retelling task, and it was not the Frog Book. They gave them these 2 books that were unfamiliar to them, one at each age, and they asked them to tell a story. And at the end of the story, they pulled out of a bag from under the table a Winnie the Pooh puppet and said, Pooh was sitting in my bag and couldn't hear the story at all. Would you mind telling Pooh the story? So they had to retell the story to Winnie the Pooh. And then they followed the children up. So at age 16, they gave them a reading comprehension task. And so the question is, can a child's ability to tell stories at 4 and 5 predict their reading comprehension when they're 16? And most of the other studies that have looked at this have just looked at a period of 2 to 3 years in terms of looking at the effects of early storytelling skill on reading comprehension. But this was the first study that has looked at it over more than a decade. And they found, lo and behold, that these early storytelling skills do predict reading comprehension more than a decade later. And this is after controlling for a child's vocabulary, for their early literacy skills, and also the parental background. And so these researchers think that there is some similar mental capacities that are going, mental processes that are going on that support children being able to understand reading even a decade later. This, to me, it speaks to the idea of this early practice in telling decontextualized, using decontextualized language through storytelling can have some enduring effects. Okay, so Teresa gave us a nice segue into supporting storytelling at home. And so what I'd like to do is share with you some general ways of supporting storytelling for the children in your life. So there are 3 main ways that I think storytelling can be supported. One is through make-believe, the second is through book reading, and the third is through reflecting and predicting about things. And so in terms of make-believe, I encourage you to incorporate more make-believe into a child's life. So this could be through making up a story with a wordless book. It could be also through just dramatic play of make-believe. So on Saturday, a couple days ago, I was talking to my kids and I told them about driverless cars. And they didn't believe me. They were like, no. I said, yes. And so I pulled up some videos and we talked about it and they were like, wow. So the next day, my 8-year-old is playing with her dolls and she has a little Jeep for them that she plays with them. And it turns out that she decided that she was going to pretend to take out the steering wheel and convert it to a driverless car. So she says, yeah, they have a Tesla and they, it carried them to the Super Carnival, because they really wanted to go. And I give you that example because the information that we expose our children to provides them with the material to then take it off it and create stories. So I encourage you to have these conversations, tell them about driverless cars or whatever else will open their minds and their imaginations to new things. And in doing so, you give them material that they can use to practice storytelling. And so that's one way. Again, wordless picture books, you've seen how many of these studies use this frog book. And I think they use it also because a lot of children are not familiar with it, so they're guaranteed that this is the first time that they're seeing these books. But there's a number of different wordless books that are out now, and they're way more complicated and give so much more detailed illustrations in terms of allowing children material to build stories. And I'm sure there's some wonderful librarians here that would help point you to some of the more current wordless picture books that are out there. The second way is reading books. And so I'm sure you've all heard about how important reading books is for literacy development. It's also important for developing storytelling skills because it gives children lots of examples of good stories. In addition, it's not just enough to read these books, but it's important to read them with questions. And so that's really the key, is to have a dialogue with children about these books and ask open-ended questions. So questions that don't just have a one-word answer, but questions that are going to prompt the child to think. So ask them questions about the plot, ask them questions about the character and what they think the character is feeling and why would the character do that. And also ask them questions to predict. You come to a point in a book and something is about to happen and you can ask the child, so what do you think is going to happen next? and then turn the page and see if that happened. And so these are ways to support children's development of, again, understanding of story structure, but also getting them to think more abstractly about different stories. And so the third way is reflecting and predicting. And so there's been a lot of stories, a lot of studies on parent-child reminiscing and how that supports narrative development. And it turns out that the way that a parent reminisces with a child about a past event can support the children's development. So for example, there's some studies that have shown that when parents emphasize the emotions of an event, children, when they tell their own narratives, they also emphasize the emotions of whatever the character is. And so in doing so, parents give children practice in telling stories and thinking about what's most important to tell in a story. It's also important to talk about what's going to happen in the future, because this is, again, gives an opportunity for decontextualized talk about something that hasn't happened yet. And so, for example, if you're planning a trip to the zoo, you can talk to the child about, okay, what animals do you think we're going to see? And then at the end, recap and reflect. And so, wow, we thought we were going to see tigers and we didn't see them. We only saw lions or cheetahs or whatever. But the idea is to make connections and to give children opportunities to practice using that decontextualized talk. Okay, and so all of these different ways really are just ways to practice more decontextualized language. So I'd like to close out with a quote by Terry Tempest Williams, who's a writer, educator, and artist. She says that storytelling is the oldest form of education. And so we know that storytelling has been used for centuries to teach and to instruct. But I want to suggest that storytelling can also be used to encourage our children to become literate citizens. And if we really want to encourage them to be better readers and writers, we should give them more opportunities to tell stories.
This program was recorded on December 9th, 2019 at the Ann Arbor District Library.